Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming back. We have one more shot this time around. And I wish that I could do all that I would like to do with this, but it's going to be a whirlwind today. I kind of expect that some of you will find this to be the most challenging session we'll probably have, because we're going to spend time mostly on this guy here. And John Wesley starts the what turns out to be a denomination that is the biggest denomination still, I think, today in the U.S. I would modify that a little bit if you consider the non-denominationalists as a whole a denomination. You know, those that do not subscribe to a particular theology, they actually do. And they just don't think of it that way. And that's, I've mentioned this a couple of times to you, I'm calling it kind of a diversion. It's kind of a Y off of the main trunk, because it really doesn't fit quite well with other things that have come. So today, what we're really going to get into, I think, is Revivalism 101. And this is not what you're used to. How many have ever been to a revival? Not too many. Oh, interesting. Well, let me tell you about the one time I did it. It was when I was in high school, and it was Father Frank B. Phillips and his Oratorium. His Oratorium was a great big white tent supported with columns of air, and I didn't know anything about it. It turns out that he was the Seventh-day Adventist. Didn't know anything about that church. Asked my minister, would it be okay if I went? So, well, yeah, I guess it's okay to have some other experiences, because I grew up Missouri Synod, so this is going to be quite a different experience. Well, the text was out of Revelation. That should get you started. And the text of the day was the beast coming out of the water and putting his mark on the people. Those who worship the beast have the mark of the beast, and they're able to buy and sell. They're able to get along in society. Those that don't accept the rule of the beast, you know, are in for tribulation and possible extermination. This is the end of the world as they see it out of the text of Revelation. So we reached the end of the service, and I discovered that, guess what the mark of the beast is? How do you know if you have the mark of the beast? Well, I'll let you ponder that for a second, and I'll back you up with another half a story. And the other half a story is there's a series of, I'm going to say 13, and maybe really 12 books that are the best-selling Christian literature, as in not quite fantasy, but certainly thriller literature of all time. Sold in excess of 50 million copies. Just fantastic. Heard about it on PBS, and I said, boy, what a bunch of losers to pay attention to that. Good grief. How could they spend good money on stuff that's obviously fiction and obviously way out there? So someone gave me book 8 out of the 12, and I started reading it, and it's the same thing. It's the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast in the Left Behind series, which is what I'm referring to here, is a computer chip that you can get just like you would do on your dog at home. So in order to buy and sell according to the beast of Revelation, you could just present your wrist if you had it there, or they could read your neck, and now you're good to go. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I got hooked. And I wound up buying or reading all of them. And the way it ends is fantastic. Jerry Jenkins and Tim LaHaye are the two authors. Tim LaHaye is the guy who is known best as a pretty far-right Christian commentator, and Jerry Jenkins is the guy that kind of puts it best into easy prose. Easy reading, speed reading, thriller literature, lots of fun. But it just starts you right down that path. And the one thing I will say about the series, quite aside from the way it ends, which I thought was excellent, is they do teach you, if you accept any of the message at all of the Left Behind series, they do get you to accept the idea that everything matters. Everything you do matters. You're either all in or you're not. And so the Left Behind series starts with the idea of the last 7 years before Jesus comes back according to their scheme of things. That will be the bulk of the next section that I plan to teach when we resume, probably in January is the current plan. So that will be out of the dispensationalist world. All right, back now to my experience in high school. The mark of the beast according to the Seventh-day Adventists. Are you ready? What's the main teaching? You probably can figure this out from the name of the church. Seventh-day Adventists. What are they driving at? Seventh day is
Saturday.
The Sabbath, and it's supposed to be Saturday. So if you belong to the beast, you worship on
Saturday. Sunday.
Oh, Lordy.
So if you got it right, you worship on Saturday.
Oh dear.
Well, this kind of struck me as something I've never heard. I can excuse me. I've not been exposed to this. So, I wanted to hear a little bit more. So they had a regular receiving line on the way out, and I'm going into that receiving line, and I say, please tell me some more about this. Tell me where I should look. Oh, that's very good, young man. Keep on going. I just basically got pushed out the door before we were done, and I didn't know any more about it. But at the end of that experience, we had an altar call. And what the altar call was that night was, do you want to be enrolled? Are you enrolled? Are you included in the Lamb's last book of life? Which means, are you saved? Are you going to be one of the ones who's damned, or are you going to be one of the ones who's going to heaven? In Revelation, Jesus opens a book. He sees whose name is in there, and who's good, kind of like Santa Claus. Naughty and nice, right? Well, if you wanted to be counted in the Lamb's last book of life, you went up to the altar. So my buddy and I that came from the church, we didn't want to be damned, So we got up and walked up and received whatever they did and went back to and that was it. But that's pretty close in a lot of ways to what we're going to see here and what we're going to talk about today in the experience that all of these folks have of these highly emotionally charged revivalistic kind of settings that want to draw you in, and they're not quite so concerned about the doctrine that goes with it. They're not quite so concerned about means of grace like we would talk about in the Lutheran Church. They're not quite so concerned about getting all the pieces right. They want your heart. They want your emotional allegiance. And you're going to see some stuff today that's not traditional Lutheran. So with that kind of an introduction, having gotten you prepared for, some interesting stuff to come, let's open with some prayer. Lord, I thank you for all these people who come here to find out more about how Americans have reacted to your word. It's good to be in your house, Lord. It's good to have these people here and to share and to learn more and to have our thoughts and our hearts engaged today. You said you'll be with us whenever 2 or 3 are gathered together, and here we are, Lord. So we ask that you stir us up. We ask that you make us think once again about what it means to be connected to you and how to show our love and how to show our love for our neighbors who are maybe not able to join us today. Maybe they're experiencing some difficulties that we're not. So we ask you to sensitize us and to make us more aware of all that's around us. And we ask that today all the words of our mouths and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight and to your glory, Lord. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So John Wesley is our guy to come. That's by way of opening. Now, I showed you this slide, but we didn't talk about it very much before, and I'm not going to talk about it a ton right now today, but I do want you to see what's coming. At the end of the Puritan era, the world is changing. What's coming is science. The biggest changes in the modern era about science that says we can start to figure out how the world works. And it's not necessarily what we grew up with if all we heard was Genesis. And this is going to shake our tree a little bit. So how do we deal with that? And there's kind of 2 ways, and maybe something in the middle, but there's the way that says, I embrace it all, and obviously Genesis is fiction. And there's this way. I don't want to have anything to do with this. This is counter to everything that I believe. Jonathan Edwards is one of the smartest guys in the colonies. And Jonathan Edwards says, I like this. It makes sense to me. I believe that God created the world. And if this is how he keeps it sustained, neat. I'm glad to hear about this. So I want to incorporate this. One of the leaders in the ELCA nationally that was the head of the Book of Faith Initiative some years back said when we gathered together in Chicago, those of us who were trying to lift up Bible in all that we do, she said, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you check your brain at the hat code on the way in. You know, God wants us to use all of our faculties to put things together. And another fellow who's still in the Missouri Synod, whose father picked the pastor that I grew up with, said, God doesn't expect us to understand the utterly incomprehensible. Now, I add Jake's codicil to that, but he does expect us to believe it sometimes. He does expect us to accept some things on faith. Well, Newton is starting to break all of that loose. He's starting to understand some of the laws of nature. And Jonathan Edwards says, that's kind of cool. At the same time, John Locke is saying the affairs of men, the affairs of people are governed by laws too. And we can see how these things work, and we can see how society works, and there are some things that we should lift up. And the American founders go all in with that. And there's, at the same time, a new kind of faith called deism that rises up and incorporates all of this kind of stuff. And can't do that right now. Maybe at some point we could look into that. It's kind of neat. But basically, I'll just give you what I was given in college. It says, the idea of God, according to deism, is a divine watchmaker. In other words, he sets the world in motion, he sets the laws, and then he takes a vacation and leaves the rest up to us. So this is what's going on in the background as Jonathan Edwards comes on the scene. And Jonathan Edwards, unfortunately, historically, has been kind of painted into a corner because of one sermon. And I'll show you that one, and you probably will remember it because it's been taught in most English literature courses for the past 200 years. And it's very unfortunate. But Jonathan Edwards is the grandson of the Stoddard that we talked about. Remember when we looked at the western side where the river comes down, and the second largest church in America, the second largest congregation, his grandpa was pastor there for 60 years. And he had the house that was on the hill that kind of blocked out the sun, so they called him the Pope, and he was the guy who was, even though they were Congregationalists, even though they were individualists. What Jonathan Edwards does is he tries to put this all together. And it turns out that Jonathan Edwards is probably the Reformed world's greatest theologian, and probably America's foremost theologian too, but he didn't have time to finish his work because of a couple of unfortunate things that happened I'll tell you about in just a second. But you remember we talked about a couple of weeks ago the halfway covenant, where the Puritans were trying to make their peace with the grandkids that need to be baptized but their parents aren't converted. So they said, well, we'll make a deal. Some can, if their mom or dad was baptized and the grandpa was converted, then okay, then they can do that. In the Lutheran Church, you had Pastor Bob explain our approach to baptism and to communion today. What's the difference? What did Pastor Bob say today about communion? Who's it for?
Everybody. Everybody.
Is it for members only?
No, everybody.
When I grew up in the Missouri Synod Church that I grew up with, not only was it for members of that church only, but you actually had to call in advance and say, I want you to reserve a cup for me. Well, the idea was that you would prepare yourself and you would think about what you were going to be taking when you had this rite, because it was too important. And there is language in Scripture that says, don't eat and drink in this unworthily. The Apostle Paul says, when the early feasts, when they were having communion and the rich folks were getting there early, and they were bringing their best barbecue and they were chowing down before the poor folks got there. So there was nothing left for them. And Paul says, guys, if you're that hungry, have a snack. You don't need to act like this. That's not what it's for. This is a love feast. This is the agape feast. This is a chance for everybody to commune and convene together. But there is something beyond just taking care of each other and being together. This is a means of grace in our language. What does that mean? A means of grace means this is what happens. What happens if it's a means of grace? You get grace. How does that happen? Who delivers the grace to you and me?
God gives it to us, the Spirit.
Yeah. Go back to your third article from your catechism. I believe that I cannot, by my own reason or strength, either believe in Jesus or come to him. But, there's the big word. Anytime you see the but, kind of a coordinating conjunction, you know what's coming is bigger. But, who calls me by the gospel? You already said it.
The Spirit.
The Spirit calls me by the gospel, enlightens me with his gifts, and then sanctifies and keeps me. Now that's where the rubber meets the road today. What is this thing about sanctification? John Wesley and his boys that are going to follow this are saying, you can get better and better and better if you get connected to God. And ultimately, if you get better and better, what's the top?
Perfect.
Yeah. So that's the idea, that's the goal. You ready for this? They call it the holiness movement. You can get more and more holy, more and more set apart, more and more sanctified, more and more close to God. Jonathan Edwards isn't going there. He's not going all that way. Jonathan Edwards is not quite so sure about this movement that we talked about yesterday or last week with George Whitfield that I'm going to come back to in a second. But just to show you he's not a dweeb, I'll give you a little bit more about him. Jonathan Edwards is a man of the world. He loves chocolate, particularly the chocolate that comes to him from Boston. It's apparently a powdered form that you make as a drink. He loves cheese from Boston. His wife likes China. His wife, by the way, is as sharp as he is. And she doesn't just give him a dozen kids, which she does, but she also is pretty sharp in her own. And when George Whitfield meets the two of them, comes to see him, he says, boy, I wish I had a wife like that. Someone that could help me out and keep me going. And he writes about it in his journal. And he says, could I please, Lord, have someone like Jonathan Edwards' wife? I really would like to have a wife, to help me. Well, unfortunately he does, but he doesn't do very well with it. More about that in a second. Okay. I wanted to do Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God with you, but you can look it up. I think it's kind of boring, frankly. It's over and over and over again. And Jonathan Edwards was not a particularly good speaker. He was kind of monotone. It was not his strength. And he's sitting here talking and looking at the wall, and his congregation is freaking out. People are crying, they're fainting, they're going ape. And he finally notices that there's all this commotion out there, and he says, would you guys just please pay attention? And he's having trouble getting through to them, he thinks. In reality, just the opposite. So I'll just give you one characterization of the part that sticks in my mind that is probably the best image from that. He says, we are like hanging from a spider web, from one strand, that's all we got. And we're over the pit. We're over the fire. And God can let go anytime where he can break that strand. He says, you've got no more to hold you back than if you were a stone at the end of that strand. That's how close you are to damnation right now. So if you want to get right, you better hurry up, because you are suspended over the fire. And people are going, ah! And it's about 8 pages long of that. And you can look it up online. It's been printed up a gazillion times. It's been in lots of English literature compendiums and so forth. And unfortunately, it's given Jonathan Edwards a bad name, because it's given the idea that he's kind of a one-trick pony, that's really all he's got. Here's Jonathan Edwards. Here's how much he's written late, just came out from Yale. If you want a copy of all of John Edwards' works, Yale will now sell it to you. If you want the online version, you can get it for about $1,500. If you want a printed version, I think it was $4,000. Because this is all brand new, this is hot stuff. Jonathan Edwards is the guy, I've mentioned R.C. Sproul before, who does the Ligonier series and is the premier theologian and teacher out of the Reformed tradition that we had on Messiah Connect here for a while. A great sponsor of the Reformation and a great believer in Luther and what Luther wrote, as well as what Calvin wrote. Brilliant guy. He says Jonathan Edwards turned him around. He said, Jonathan Edwards is the one that made me understand how predestination it works. Oh, really? So this is kind of the top guy of the Reform side, speaking of. Well, I want to do just a very brief, this is going to be brickbat number 1. I'm going to warn you, this is not going to be nice and it's not going to be fun. But part of the Puritan way of seeing things was that the world is against us. Remember, what's the meaning of Puritan in the first place? What are they trying to purify? The church. And so their view is everybody's against us. Everybody's trying to keep us from doing that. So in the closest ring of those who are against us, it's those who don't believe like we do, and those who are challenging us. But that's not all. There are what the Apostle Paul says, powers and principalities that are out there. That, in other words, there's spiritual warfare in the language of the non-denominationalists going on. There's people fighting against us. the devil and his dominions. So increasingly, as these circles range out, you're getting closer to Satan himself. Now look what's closest to it. You get Catholicism and Papalism. That you can figure out because that's what they're trying to purify from. But now it's the Indians after that, and then the Africans. Why would the Africans be further out? Because the Indians are indigenous, they're local, but the Africans are imported. So they've brought foreign ideologies, foreign practiced voodoo and the like with them. They brought their witch doctors and everything else. And these guys are crazy scared of that. So when you see that they are looking at the world and their world is defined as everything is working against us, they're always looking for signs. Is God pleased with us or is God angry with us? So if something goes bad, God's showing his anger. If they have a good crop, we must have been doing something good for a while. If there's a shipwreck, well, blame it on God's displeasure. And that's their world. So what happens when we know about the Salem witch trials that you've heard about is internationally there's already some of this going on. There's a bunch of witch trials going on in Europe too. We're not alone in that. But there was a particularly virulent form of it in Salem, and they did something really weird. They gave it over to the non-church people. Usually the church people up to this point had handled it if someone claimed there was a witch in their midst. And the church people would call people in and take testimony and see if they thought it made sense, and maybe ship the person off somewhere else if they thought that would help fix it. This time they took it over and gave it to the civil magistrates. In other words, they gave it to the judges in the town. And these judges were caught up in this, and they got caught up in a whirlwind of suspicion, and in the religious language they called them credulous. That's a funny word to me because the root of it suggests believable. Credulous means you'll believe anything. You'll accept, and that's what they did. So it all started with actually a couple of girls that went into convulsions or epileptic fit or something like this in the presence of a Haitian slave. And actually one of the parsons, one of the ministers. And they said that her specter had invaded these girls and done that to them. And they believed it. And so there's no defense. You'd say, I wasn't even there. And they say, well, but your specter was. Your spiritual self was there. And they hanged a dozen, if I remember it right. I think it was 12. And there was another one, I think it was a man. They weren't all women. And there was another one, if you're ready for this, that was pressed to death.
Pressed?
They literally put him under big rocks. So the Puritans have to deal with all of that, and that's going on. But that's not all. I also got to talk with you about something that I agonized over how much time to spend on this. But it's going to come up already in the very first people that we've already introduced, and this is slavery. Slavery in the church. Slavery in the connection with those that are in New England. You would think that they would not have anything to do with it, but they were part and parcel in it by virtue of what comes to be known as triangular trade. It's a little easier to see in this depiction. Basically what happens is you've got a three-way series of trades that goes on. Sometimes it's all concentrated down here, but basically it's molasses, which they turn into rum. And the rum is used to pay for goods that are manufactured, that are sold in Africa in return for trade, in return for slaves. They take what's known as the Middle Passage because it's easier to navigate. Remember, they're under sail; they're not under diesel. So they're following the trade winds. Question?
No.
No, that's funny.
So it's 1, 2, 3, and sometimes it's not quite that simple, but you get the idea. And look where the apex is, look where the action is, it's New England. So no one gets off scot-free. Yes, the slaves did come into Virginia first. Yes, the southern plantation system is where the slavery system got its most virulent. But nobody escapes scot-free in all of this. And it isn't until we get into the revival world that we're going to get to next that we start to see some response to this. Now, George, that we talked about last week, is a slave owner. But, there's always the big but. Why did he have slaves? Because he was funding an orphanage. He was very keen on this one orphanage down in Savannah, Georgia. And he said, I have to have these slaves. I have to have these slaves in order to make the orphanage possible. And there's a very famous slave girl named Phyllis Wheatley who writes a poem about George Whitefield and says what a great guy he is. Okay, see what you think. The guy that started out, the Fruelinghuisen guy, the Dutch minister that came over and converted to Presbyterianism in the Northeast, brought a slave over from Nigeria, and he made him a house slave. And his family was quite wealthy and became scions of these. This is a minister. You know, they're very much part and parcel of it. George Whitefield gave talks supporting slavery, saying it was a good thing, saying we needed to do that. Nobody gets scot-free, as I say. But George Whitefield and maybe Jonathan Edwards, who started preaching at the same time roughly as Whitefield is cranking up with his big efforts, and John Wesley and his troops are responsible for what comes to be known as the Great Awakening. Now, what did George Whitefield do that was so different? We talked about what he said and the reaction that he got. First thing he did is his crowds were too big to put in any church. Always he preached to big crowds, so many times thousands. I told you about Ben Franklin's calculation that said he could have talked to 30,000 at once. He would talk in Boston Square and everybody could hear him because he practiced and he worked and he had a great voice to do it. Shocking thing. Imagine this. First guy to memorize his sermons. Can you feature that? What a thought. All these learned Presbyterians and Calvinists and Congregationalists and all these Puritans are so learned that they have to read their sermon word by word. And that was part of Jonathan Edwards' problem. He was not a very good orator. George is a fantastic orator. You know, he really gets them stirred up, and you'll see how. But the first thing he did is he didn't need any notes because he practiced it. Not only did he memorize them, but he practiced it in front of a mirror so that he could get his gestures down. Now, one of the challenges that's made about this is, well, that's not preaching, that's acting. Acting is for the theater. The theater's a place for ruffians and prostitutes and pickpockets and everyone that's bad goes to the theater.
Dear.
Right? Does that work for you?
No, that's not right.
Not so much, but his response to that is, yeah, we use some of the things that they use in the theater, but guess what? While you're deriding, you know, what's going on, the theaters are full, and how full are your churches? How are they doing? He said, so sure, I use that. And then remember what Ben Franklin said to his buddies, don't bring your money because he's going to talk you out of it. And he was pretty good at that. So he used a lot of dramatic gestures, a lot of skills that were unusual for the time. A lot of presentation kinds of things. Okay, I'm gonna roll on even though we didn't get to do all of that. He'd actually cry. He'd get so emotionally wrought up. Can you imagine? We had an interim pastor at my old church that would cry when he preached sometimes. And about half the church would go, "Oh no, not again." Unfortunately, he was not originally from America, so it was just that much harder to work with him when he was so emotional and so wrought up. But it wasn't just him, it was his crowd too. His crowd would respond to this. If they're getting goosed up, if they're getting, real enthused, they're giving it back. Now, put yourself in the position of an old-time minister who has, for the first time, a big church in maybe Philadelphia, in a nice cathedral-like setting, and who's reading a sermon week after. How's he going to react to all of this? He's going to be real happy to have, not much more happy than my minister was when I went to see Father Frank B. Phillips. They're not too thrilled. And here's the kicker. Here's where it really kind of starts to come home, that you can still see today that people have inherited this connection as well. The big tie, the big important thing about a revival is that you connect personally, emotionally. And this personal, emotional connection is about to go in a direction that will surprise you. So, George Whitefield had no church, but what he did is he put a beautiful PR campaign together. Every time he was going to come to a city, he made sure that he took out ads in the newspaper. He bought flyers to be tacked up on, they didn't have telephone poles, but whatever they had places, in town that there could be an announcement. People knew he was coming, and they would come in from all around. There's this story about a farmer that came in, and as they approached Boston, there was a great big cloud of dust that came up from all the people coming from everywhere. And finally, he and his wife got in with their horse, and everybody was brown by the time they got in. They were all, and she said, "My dress is going to be ruined, we're going to be disgusting looking." But they didn't care, because they got to see George Whitefield. He was probably the most famous man in America at the time. He rode on horseback all up and down the East Coast. Only person to ever have done that at the time. It isn't until the Methodists, 100 years later, that anybody does more travel than George Whitefield did. And he amassed quite a following. Wherever he went, he published. Now, Jonathan Edwards publishes his sermons. George Whitefield published his journal. That got him into trouble, because he wrote in his journal exactly what he thought. You saw some of those quotes last time. It said, "The reason that the churches are dead is because dead people preach to them." Ooh. How do you like that if you're one of those dead pastors? You're not going to be too thrilled with this guy. And everywhere he went, he was very much concerned with his image and using that image to get still more people out. He didn't last very long. He died after he was about 55 years old. And one of the things that Luther had argued against was the idea of pilgrimages, because pilgrimages became one of the things that you could do to earn favor with God according to the Catholic Church. You could make a pilgrimage to one of the holy sites and get some good marks to maybe shorten your time in purgatory. Luther said, we don't want any pilgrimages. Guess what? George Whitefield gets pilgrimages for him. As the American soldiers are going up to Canada to try and enlist the support of some of the Canadians to the revolution's cause, they stop at George Whitefield's tomb. And they asked for his collar and his cuffs so that they could artifacts, just like you would do relics, to carry with them for, I suppose, for good luck. I mean, that's why you want relics, and this is not the way we think of in the Lutheran Church, right? But this is kind of how much he was adored. So George Whitefield, you sum it up, he's a little bit of all kinds of things. But what he starts out as, and this is where I want to set the stage now for what's going to come, because this is where you're going to get one of these kinds of things going on. He starts out with John Wesley and their buddies in England. I think he actually joins Wesley's holiness movement for a little while, but basically they don't do anything together. Then they re-meet on one of the trips. He made 7 trips, so did Wesley, to America, and preached to thousands and thousands. Wesley preached to about 18,000, I think I read. And, you know, remember that this is not in the age of social media. This is not in the age of TV. This is, you're going to ride your horse into town, maybe for 3 days, you know, to get to see these guys. So if you got to George Whitefield, eventually the impression that I get is they held him above ground until they couldn't stand it anymore. That's the impression that I get. And then they finally buried him, but they must have kept his clothes because they gave some of these artifacts over it. But what we're going to see with Wesley is Wesley's going to make a big departure from Calvin. And he's going to embrace this thing called Arminianism, and we mentioned once or twice. Arminianism is an idea off a Dutch theologian that says it's not all up to God. Luther was wrong. You can come to God on your own. You can do it by your own reason or strength. But you have to make a decision and you have to follow it up with commitment. Well, George Whitefield isn't going there. He's going to stay with Calvinism, and he's going to preach predestination on the stump, and he's going to get people riled up and say, I gotta get converted in a hurry or I'm going to hell. And that's still there. That kind of language is still out there. So surprisingly, toward the end of his life, he moderated a little bit. Maybe he fell in love a second time. I'm not sure exactly how this worked out, but after he had a not so great marriage and his wife died, he left everything that he had to someone that he kind of partnered up with to work on the orphanage and to work on social causes. So a lot of people will say George Whitefield had his heart in the right place, and he said it with money, which is a pretty good thing. Pretty good way to end one's life. But I think he made it to like 55. I think that's about all the time that he had. So who's next? Let's take a look at the summary of the first Great Awakening, because what I want to do now is propel you into the second Great Awakening, which comes about 100 years later, not quite. So be prepared to see what you think. You know, if you want to take time to go into these, that's okay, because we can always come back. But after the first one, I don't expect everybody to say yes, yes, yes. So we start. Anybody have any problem with that one? Is anyone perfect in here?
Original sin.
Okay. Now let's see what you think about this. My former pastor wouldn't accept that. She's a universalist. Universalist says Jesus cared enough and bled enough, did enough to save everybody, and he's going to do it. Pol Pot, Adolf Hitler, Mao Zedong, Genghis Khan, take your pick. They all have a chance. And Jesus could do this. So he will. You buy that? Keep thinking.
So excuse me, are you really saying are you really saying universal salvation then?
Yes.
Okay. Salvation for everyone's saved.
Yeah.
Okay.
Somehow.
Yeah.
And in fact, I may have mentioned this to you, the Wisconsin Synod had a history book about their denomination that I encountered, that they used to use to teach when they had schools. There's one in Pomona that no longer exists as a school, but there was a statement inside that said that was why they separated from the Missouri Synod, because there were too many Universalists in the Missouri Synod. And I thought, really? Well, at the time I thought Universalism was like Unitarianism, and what that meant was one God and, you know, no Trinity kind of thing. And I started looking it up, and I said, no, there's no Universalists in the Missouri Synod. I've been with these guys. So I started looking at some of the old history and the old superstars. Yeah, there are some. You can find some out there. So if they were making some noise in the Wisconsin people, it's a very small synod even now. But you could see why they would not go down this path. And it's even an issue for the Methodists. Even the Methodists don't want to go there, you know, when they encounter it on the hustings. We'll keep going and see what you think about this. By this one? This is Revivalism 101. Give it up.
This is what we need.
Anyone want to take that on?
Well,
You sign up for the church of what's presented here?
Why do they have, how does 2 and 3 relate? They seem to be opposite.
Pardon?
No, the second one and the third one seem to be opposite, because the second one says, I don't gotta do anything.
Doesn't have to be consistent.
And the third one, why not?
They don't, you know, that is not going to be a big concern of theirs.
Okay, all
I think
right.
the third
But
one is the
if-
salvation. The second
if
one
you
is
are-
saying
if you don't have salvation, go ahead.
The third one is how to be saved.
Okay.
Try
I
it
think
again.
the second one is saying that you need the salvation in order to go to heaven, and then the third is how you get
Yeah.
that salvation.
Yeah.
So that's how 2 and 3 relate.
Okay.
Yeah, but you have to confess, and this is where the non-denominationalists absolutely square in. They say you have to have that born-again moment. You have to have that moment where you say, I give up. I'm not in charge. You are. I give myself over to you, God. And if you can't say that, if you can't say that you've reached that point, you're not, in the language of the Puritans, you're not regenerate yet. You haven't been regenerated. You haven't really been fully converted. You may believe, but to believe is not enough. I have this little expression about Lutheranism. I call it the Great Lutheran Cop-Out. It says, I believe, therefore I'm saved. I'm glad that's over with.
But, yeah, I mean, I would think it'd have to be more, because Satan believes.
Well, try this one. See what you think about this one. Put that in the context of Pastor Bob and Pastor Jay. This church is pretty good about talking about this. It's not made a central article of faith as much as the Great Awakening, as the conversion-ites would do. But this is the emotional side. Pastor Jay did talk today about the beginnings of pietism. That's what this is. That is, I have a personal connection with God. And then the non-denominationalists beat us over the head with this every time. You know, that's back to my Great Lutheran Cop-Out. If it's a head trip, you're not connected emotionally. You haven't given your life to God. You haven't come over all the way if all you do is believe. Yeah, I accept that. Revelation teaches that at the end of time, there will be people that will say, yeah, I know who he is. I know who Jesus is, but I ain't going there. I choose the alternative, even when they know where it's going to take them. Does that make any sense? Doesn't have to. Now this gets you back into predestination. You know, Are those people gonna be saved? Is the universalist right that somehow someone's gonna get next to them before the final time is called? Jesus says in Matthew 25, I'm gonna have sheep and goats. And some of the goats are gonna be over in the corner saying, hey Jesus, I'm over here, I tithed, I went to church, I did the right things. And what's Jesus gonna say to them?
I didn't know
I never
you.
knew.
I didn't know you. Yeah, you may have believed that you knew who I was, but you didn't act like it. You didn't integrate it in any kind of way that I knew you. You were not part of my flock. My sheep know my name, and when I call, they come. Did you come? No, not so much. I had other things to do. Football was on. If my Packers were playing or my Vikings were playing.
49ers.
This is a tough one. I don't have an easy answer for that. But like this one, see what you think about this one. This church has got a real good answer to this one, but it's tough.
Isn't that a personal preference?
As I was growing up in the Missouri Synod, you knew what you were going to believe. You knew what was right. You knew your doctrine. They told you what it should be. Did you get much of the love? Was it informal? Kind of the opposite of casual. It was very
Unless it's not whether it's
too
formal.
low.
It's not whether it's formal or casual for me. It's more of the community of
Well,
believers.
I think the word maybe that would help Kathy a little bit would be if it was familiar. There was a guy, a Catholic priest by the name of Malcolm Boyd. I can kind of recommend his first book to you because it kind of shook a lot of people's trees when I was in college. It's called Are You Running With Me, Jesus? And it completely revolutionized the idea of prayer. This priest, this Catholic priest by the name of Malcolm Boyd, was a runner. And as he ran, he talked to Jesus. He said, it's a rainy day, Jesus. I see a lot of cloud today. Is that prayer?
It's an element of keeping in communication.
Yeah.
And I think that's what God wants. He wants us to communicate when you throughout your daily life.
But it's a rainy day. You don't think Jesus knows it's raining?
It doesn't matter.
Well, but
Yeah.
if we're gonna base
I
it
think
on what
that's
Jesus
right.
knows, he knows
I'm with you.
everything.
I agree. But I mean, this was a whole new idea that you could talk to God without saying thee and thou and being on your knees and being stilted and highfalutin. The idea that you could have a relationship. What a concept, have a relationship. That's what these guys are doing. That's, I think, a big part of the secret of their appeal. You know, why they were so successful. Because the Puritan world is kind of coming to an end with all of its formalism and all of its expectations of you've got to confess publicly and you've got to be tried in front of the church community in order to be allowed, you know, to come on in and all the business. What's going to happen in the next 100 years is the women are going to start getting involved in this. And the women are going to start preaching. And the women are going to start teaching. And they're going to start movements. And they're going to start churches. And some of them are going to be as kooky as anything that the men can come up
Start
with.
making sense.
So let's take a quick look at who's coming next. What comes next is the revolution. And I just want to show you this slide right here. By the way, this is a famous, it's again in New England. Anyone know what this picture's about?
Boston Massacre.
Yeah, this is the so-called Boston Massacre. Not actually the way that it's taught in grade school. These were a bunch of ruffians that were drunk and that were kind of assaulting the British officers who finally got PO'd enough that they unslung their arms. And one of the first guys to die, who had been shot,
Crispus
was a
Atticus.
guy by the name of Crispus Attucks, who happened to be
Black.
black. So, he's a freedman, he wasn't a slave. So, the point of this picture is to show you that there are battles all throughout the colonies. It's not just New England, even though we tend to associate all the big battles that we remember and that we go to on vacation with the East Coast up here in and around Boston Harbor. So now you're starting to get big churches. Here's the church where Jonathan Edwards preached. It's a real church. Here's the oldest church in Richmond, Virginia. Again, why am I showing Virginia? Because we're starting to shift. Slavery starts in Virginia. What else starts in Virginia? Who else is from Virginia that we pay attention to?
Jefferson.
Most of the superstars of the American Revolution, most of the guys who write our original documents, most of the people who are America's leaders in the first go-round are out of Virginia. So the scene is shifting to the south. And the scene is going into that mixed economy, not so much just the manufacturing and the north and the Erie Canal, but now we're going into the plantations and so forth. So this is Revival Part 2. And I guess I'm not going to get to Methodism this time today, but I'll give you a hint about it. But I'll show you a little bit about it. This is the Second Great Awakening. It starts really at the beginning of the century. And it starts, of all places, you would never think of this, in Kentucky. Yeah. Trans-Appalachia, the area that takes you all the way out to the Mississippi River. Up to this point in time, the first 100 miles is pretty much all there is. You stay close to the ocean for the first go-round. Now you've got, after the Revolutionary War, you've got this massive expansion of America, and these people don't have any churches. And they might not even have much religious background. And there's no church to go to. And they're spending all their time farming or hunting and trapping, and there's not much for them to get to otherwise. So some guys start a series of revivals right at the turn of the century, and again, they're outdoors. Here's this guy, James McGready. He's a Presbyterian, and he invents something that the Methodists will perfect. But he invents something called the camp meeting. The camp meeting is where we'll have church outdoors. We'll follow George Whitfield's example, but we won't any more than George Whitfield knew how many he was going to see. We'll just say, we're going to meet here and y'all come. So they called it communion. That's interesting thought. And the idea is it was going to be 3 days, and they would build a kind of a primitive scaffolding-like podium where people could stand and preach, and they just run ministers through them and preach at them all the time. And all these guys are emotional. They're all following the same kind of a deal that Whitfield would. They've all learned. They've all memorized their speeches, as it were, and they're all exhorting these ruffians, these people that are, you know, the moonshine drinking, the eye gouging, the pig eating, these ruffians that are from the frontier. They're told, give your soul to Jesus, come on around. And for some of them, this is a hugely emotional experience. Cane Ridge was supposed to be 3 days. It lasted a week until they ran out of food. You know, people brought their own food, and they camped, and they had no idea what was going to happen. And they still, to this day, don't know how many people came, but it was at least 10,000 and maybe close to 30. And they just came from all over the place. Now, the thing that was interesting about it was you already have this kind of dichotomy, this kind of split between the old church people that are interested in doctrine, that are interested in church discipline, that are interested in getting things right. And then you've got these emotional people that are interested in conversion. So they have an expression. The old timers that are the conservatives, they call themselves the old lights. meaning we're close to what's right. We've got well, nothing daunted, the young Turks that are coming in that are seeing, we have a new way of relating to God. We're the new lights. So you got old lights and new lights, and the old lights are in the language of Patrick Allett, who does this particular great courses. I kind of recommend this. I've mentioned these kinds of things to you before, that I can grab them off of eBay. He talks about how this worked, and it's kind of strange. It doesn't fit with our expectation with how people are going to react. But they had massive physical reactions. They called them exercises. Now, it's not exercises like we're talking about where you're going to the gym. This is where you lose control of your body. So there's two particular kinds of exercises that the preachers wrote about. There's the falls and the jerks. I think you could probably figure out what's going on with the falls, right? Thousands of people emit a scream, a holler, down they go. Just out of it, just flat on the ground. Doesn't matter if there's mud, whatever, you just lose control of your body, you're gone, you're down. The jerks could be just at one part of your body, usually the head, or the whole body. Here's a picture of the jerks going on. Lyman Beecher is one of the old lights. Interestingly, he's a father of Harriet Beecher Stowe. He's one of the guys that says, you guys are way off base. This is not what God wants. He's not interested in people freaking out. If you want to be close to God, you should be in your right mind, not out of your mind. But I'm taking a lot of this from, by the way, a source that I hope you'll look up on your own at some point. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has what they call Cyclopedia, easy to find online. And it's an outline of pretty much every topic religiously, historically, or doctrinally that you want to find. And if you want to get close to some of the stuff that Lutherans have said, and that Lutherans have said about other faiths, Cyclopedia is a great source. It's a simple source, it's free, you can get there. But now imagine you're watching people going through jerks. It's like a grand mal seizure, only worse. And he describes how jerks could be forward and back or side to side, and just, well, what Patrick Allett, this prof, says is that the old lights who saw this sort of thing were horrified. I can well imagine that they were. I can well imagine this is something that would stick in their craw, and that they would have a hard time putting sense to. So, what do we make of all of this? Here's the grand mal seizure or hysteria. Yeah, it wasn't everybody that did it, but thousands did. And they piled up on top of each other and freaked out the world. I want to go here sometime and see that site because my younger brother is in Louisville. I don't know how far that is, but I'm going to look it up. Because I just can't imagine how this sort of thing could work. That you've got 20,000 people like a Woodstock kind of a thing. And they're all getting together and they all got their campfires and they go in and they hear somebody and they freak out and lose it. And that something about that says I want to be on that ground and see what that feels like. Silly me. So where I got to leave you today is that this became one half, I'm going to say, maybe a third, because they do preach, of the Methodist methodology. The Methodists start out with Wesley saying, I think everybody who wants to be connected to God should do like I do. I think they should study the Bible. I think they should pray a certain number of hours a day. I think they should do this, this, and this. and people jeered and sneered at him and said, "You're a Methodist. You know, you don't,
Oh,
you just believe in a method." And Wesley says, like often happens in you know, when the moniker is thrown out at you, he says, "I kind of like that." Sort of like Obamacare. He didn't like that at first, and now he says, "Yeah, I'll take that." Sort of the same deal. This becomes a big model for how Methodism starts. The second part, which I was going to have our readers do, but we'll pick it up next time, is circuit riders. The idea that the Methodists had is, as westward expansion moved, nobody should be beyond the reach of the gospel. And so they got volunteers to ride circuit, basically almost for free. Most of the time they went a long time without being paid. You know, they had a hard time collecting their money. They would freeze, they didn't know where they were going to sleep, they didn't know how they were going to, they just believed. What did they have in the way of method? Not much. They had a Bible, they had a songbook, and they had Wesley's method as put together. That's all they had in their backpack, and maybe one change of clothes. And they'd ride out, and that's how Methodism got its start. It went everywhere where they ate, everywhere where the churches worked, and it was phenomenally successful. And so this camp meeting style appealed to the two denominations that we'll see coming up that are mainstream today, but were fringe in the early days. The Baptists and the Methodists. This is how they got their big start. I want to tell you one story. Peter Cartwright. Peter Cartwright is one of these circuit riders. No degree, no training, nothing. There's one guy who is the leader of the Methodist fold. He becomes a bishop. He becomes one of the early organizers. And he basically deputizes and ordains Peter Cartwright to be one of these circuit riders. Peter Cartwright loved to organize against others that were also out there. The Universalists were very strong in different places. All kinds of outrageous little sects popping up. Remember, there's no controls. This is the frontier. So he comes up against this one group called the Halcyon Church. The guy claims himself the leader of the Halcyon Church. He says he gets messages from above. You know, he's the second coming. He's the guy who's going to lead forward for Jesus to come. And he goes into pretend trances, and Peter Cartwright says, I'm going to show him. He can't wait to get into contest with these guys. So this guy who's running the Halcyon Church and making noises about how he's got a special pipeline to God has some tricks up his sleeve. And one of them is he puts a little gunpowder at the base of a tree, and he's talking, and he's kind of accidentally on purpose throws his cigar down into the, and he says, boom, big flash, and everybody, he says, I think we just got visited. You know, I think God is with him. Peter Cartwright goes up, he says, that smells like brimstone to me. I think you were good. That's a demonic visit. That's not a visit from God. So he's interested in making the contest. But these circuit riders are something else. And they are the ones that are going to lead America to its largest denomination. That's it for now. We'll see you in a few months. We'll start again. Thank you all.